On Sunday, people in Spain elect a new parliament, and a shift to the right seems possible. That's even though Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's leftist coalition can shine with economic successes. The economy grew by 5.5% last year, stronger than it has been in decades. So the central bank recently raised its forecast for this year from 1.6 to 2.3%. Prime Minister Sanchez has also launched a 45 billion euro stimulus package to ease the burden on citizens. Sales tax on basic foods like bread, milk and eggs has been abolished, and a price cap has been introduced for electricity and gas. This is intended to curb price increases. Unemployment is around 13%, although still alarmingly high. It is at its lowest level in 15 years. Also, a minimum income is supposed to help Spain's poorest, but some companies say it's having the opposite effect.
Garlic is a key ingredient in Spanish cuisine and a key to understanding how Spain's minimum income works. This company on the East Coast processes and exports thousands of tons of the pungent bulbs a year. Most workers earn minimum wage here, but there's only been a muted response to the news that they're getting a raise. It's good, but not in the way it ought to be, thanks to the high prices when we go shopping. If those prices were lower, we would be better off. For unions, the minimum wage boost is a big step forward. For 6 years, we've had a continuous increase in the minimum wage. This is a way of distributing wealth and making a large number of workers in Spain better off. We're talking about more than 2 million workers. Employees at the garlic wholesaler, mostly women, benefit from the wage increase, at least the ones who still have jobs.
Because we are selling less to the supermarkets and costs are also going up, we have been forced to lay off some workers.
In the past 6 months, a quarter of the 160 workers have been let go. A few kilometers away, Thierry Calivert calculates that he now has to pay €12.23 per hour to each worker on his mandarin farm, and that adds up. At least 70 people are needed to work the 300 hectares. Nearly half of the people on minimum wage in Spain work in agriculture, so raising it can be difficult for employers.
Our profit margin keeps shrinking because we can't pass on our increased costs to supermarkets. And that makes our situation very complicated.
It's not clear yet what the consequences of the minimum income will be for Spain's economy as a whole, especially in the absence of statistical surveys. But what stands out?
Unemployment figures are no longer falling as steadily in Spain as they are in other European countries.
It could be that the increased minimum income is difficult to digest, especially in the countryside.
Let's get more on the situation in Spain so shortly before the elections from Gayle Allard. She's an economist at IE University in Madrid. Welcome to DW, Gayle. Now, raises in minimum wage, an economy that's growing steadily and inflation which has been tamed. Why is Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez nevertheless facing an uphill battle in trying to get re-elected?
Well, I think if we give a little background to this, it might be a little clearer. Spain is doing really well. It's one of the, it's showing one of the fastest growth rates in the leading economies now for the third straight year. But if we look at where the recovery is coming from, some of these issues are not hitting your average citizen. So, for example, tourism is doing very well. Despite this heat wave, it's doing extremely well. But what does that do? Well, it does bring in a lot of jobs, but they are generally covered by immigrants, and it pushes up rents. A lot of them are going to Airbnb. So this is a source of problems. We're seeing a strong growth in housing investment, but a lot of that is foreigners. So we're seeing a lot of American and, North American, U.S. and Mexican money come in, as well as European money, because Spanish housing is still pretty reasonable. You're seeing demand for housing from remote workers, again, not hitting your middle class and pricing people out of the market. And then we also have to remember that Spain was one of the countries that suffered the most from the Eurozone crisis, from the pandemic. So there has been a lot of ground to recover, and it is recovering it, but those memories are very strong. And of course, inflation. Inflation is eminently unpopular. Spain has had a lot of inflation. It's come way down. It's doing really well. But this means, lower real income. So these are real issues for the average Spaniard.
So I guess the recent positive economic figures are somewhat distorting the picture here. How much are economic concerns then on people's minds when they cast their ballot?
They are on people's minds, very much. There are the other concerns, which are the xenophobic concerns, and, the fear that immigrants are, particularly Muslim immigrants, are going to sort of take away their country. And this is a new thing in Spain. I was always so proud. I'm an immigrant, of course. I was always so proud that Spain didn't have a right-wing anti-immigrant party, but now they do. I live in a neighborhood where, you never saw even electoral posters. And yesterday I saw 3 cars with flags flying, sort of Trump style, and books on the doors of the cars. So, there's a feeling there, a dissatisfaction in a country with a serious demographic crisis about, this invasion of immigrants and what does it do to Spain.
Gayle, there are fears that developments like bike lanes in cities or low-emission zones could be turned back under a possible rightist government. How justified are these concerns?
I'm actually not terribly convinced by that, because in Spain there's a pretty strong consensus that, environmental issues are real, something needs to be done about them. They see the rest of Europe doing it. There's not a strongly articulated position against that. So I wouldn't see the country going back there. I think probably what we're going to have more difficulty with is how do the different parties address fiscal issues, because Spain is a country that has, it's had a very high deficit. The debt has gone way up. And so, how do you improve that? They're planning to have the debt. They told Europe they'd have their debt below 110% of GDP in 2024. How are you going to get there? Whatever party is elected is going to have to either reverse a lot of the transfers that the left-leaning party has had. They promised to cut taxes. Both the PP and Vox want to cut taxes. So how do you do that? You're going to have to cut back on spending. That's going to be a tough thing.
Gayle, you mentioned the heat wave. Now, could this stifling heat actually be a factor when people cast their ballot? Because persistently high temperatures could be a threat to Spain's tourism industry.
I am not sure the average person is thinking too much about that either. I think they're suffering from the heat, of course, and we're concerned about older people in particular here. But I think in general, I think this is true in other countries. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of fear. The Ukraine crisis introduced a lot of fear, and we followed headlines day after day after day about the coming recession, how huge it was going to be, how German industry was going to stop altogether, all of these things. And I think people are very influenced by this kind of superficial view of the economy. So I would think that again is more important to them than I don't think they make the connections with the heat wave and tourism.
So Sunday's elections are snap elections, which are happening in the middle of the summer, which is quite unusual for Spain. More than 2.5 million people have chosen to mail in their vote. And now some politicians are fueling fears about possible fraud. How much of a concern is that?
It's a very controlled process here. I think it probably is in every European state. So again, this is hype. I think it was even imported from the U.S. debate, right? No particular reason to believe it. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of electoral fraud.
Gayle, let's talk about unemployment. The unemployment rate in Spain has come down significantly, but is still quite high. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we have to remember that Spanish unemployment went up to, 25% after the global financial crisis, and now it's down to 11.5. So it's quite an improvement. And Spain has a hard time getting below 8 or 9. So, it's quite good. Of course, we're interested in the quality of jobs generated, but, the unemployment situation is good. And Spain was one of the biggest creators of employment in Europe in the first quarter of 2023. So again, we have to see it in perspective. Spain does have a lot of structural issues, like seasonal work, like, the labor market is very rigid, which affect its ability to really get that unemployment rate down. Of course, the underground employment, too, is an issue there. So it's a pretty good figure for Spain.
Spain is the recipient of the second highest amount of funds coming from the EU Recovery Fund trying to address the pandemic. How is that factoring in when it comes to the Spanish economy?
I think from outside, it would be very easy to say that's the reason Spain is growing so well. But if we get really precise about this and we look at the funds they were supposed to receive over the period, about 5%, more than 5% of GDP, which is very substantial. But Spain has had a lot of trouble actually budgeting and spending those funds because, getting projects approved is difficult. The bureaucracy is quite imposing. So what we find if we really look at this closely, that the central government was only in 2022 was only able to disperse 30% of the amount they expected to spend in that year. So we're talking about a really low level of, I suppose you would call it, execution. Hopefully, they'll do a little better, and I'm sure, with elections coming, they've tried really hard in the first part of this year to accelerate the process. So we might see, even maybe a tripling of that amount, and that could add 1 percentage point to GDP. But up until now, we can't really credit those funds with a lot of Spain's good performance.
Gayle Allard, economist at IE University in Madrid. Gayle, thank you for your time.